Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Treanor. I'm the Dean of Georgetown Law. And I'm pleased to welcome you all. And on behalf of myself and Mary Novak and Amy Ullman, to collaborate with John Carr and Kim Daniels of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life for this event to explore the role of the law and lawyers in the clergy sexual abuse scandal. It has been a long and difficult year. Events last summer reopened the floodgates of pain and anger regarding incidents of abuse and for how many cases were handled and too often mishandled. As the names of credibly accused priests were being released for the parishes in New Jersey, where I grew up, where my kids spent their summers, I saw too many names I knew and felt overwhelmed by frustration and sorrow. Each case, each failure to address the wrong represents many lives that have been shattered and devastated. But we gather tonight on a law school campus. This is a place where we train future lawyers to ask difficult questions, often in the face of accusations of wrongdoing. They spend long hours mastering civil and criminal procedural protections. The study of law challenges all of us to navigate the multiple and at times competing values that our system embraces. Both truth and justice, the dignity of the accused and the dignity of those who've been harmed, and many other sets of values that are in tension. It is not easy to bring together these values, especially now. And that is why we are so fortunate to have with us tonight a stellar panel of people who have worked for truth, justice, and healing in the midst of these tensions, as well as a moderator who is himself a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. We hope that together with the wonderful slate of programs that the initiative has offered over the course of this past year, tonight can be an example of how universities can contribute in the midst of this crisis, with thoughtful conversation across our differences and hopeful commitment to work together as we discern paths forward for the future. So I'm grateful to all of you. These are topics of the most fundamental importance. They are difficult topics. And I want to express my gratitude to each of you for being here tonight. And now let me turn our discussion over to John Carr, who will moderate and who will introduce our speakers. John?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. This feels a little bit like church. Everyone's crowded near the door and there's no one in the front pew. So if you're having trouble seeing the panel, there's room over here. It's a great honor to be a part of this, and particularly to be here at Georgetown Law School. This is the end of a long day for a bunch of us. At the invitation of the law school, we gathered early this morning, an amazing group of people, 40, 50 people. We had survivors, we had prosecuting attorneys, we had plaintiffs' attorneys, we had people who defended the church, we had social workers, psychologists, leaders of religious orders, public officials, theologians, and we tried to focus on the legal dimensions of the clerical sexual abuse crisis. As Bill mentioned, we have had a number of sessions at the initiative. I think this is our fifth. We don't focus on ecclesial matters. We had a wonderful session 10 days ago on work, the dignity of work with leaders of business and labor and Microsoft and somebody who helped reentry of workers. We'll be talking later this year about faith and the faithful in the campaign. But candidly, we could not focus on the intersection of faith and public life without dealing with the human, the moral, the institutional costs of this crisis. This crisis in our mind has two parts. One is the abuse of young people over the last decades, a horror touching thousands of lives. And the second part of it is failed leadership, which enabled or minimized or did not come to grips with that abuse. And we're focusing on both. The law and lawyers have been at the center of both those crises. It'd be fair to say without the action of lawyers, this crisis would still be hidden in many ways. It was plaintiffs' attorneys who sued the church and took on this crisis. And we owe them a lot. There were attorneys who advised the church, some of whom said, don't worry, we'll handle this. We can make this go away. Don't meet with victims. Don't apologize. Don't acknowledge. Other diocesan attorneys said, be a pastor. Do what's right and we'll handle the rest of it. We've had grand juries, Pennsylvania being the most recent, but dozens of state actors are investigating the church. Mountains of money have been spent on the legal dimension. Some of it, thankfully, a lot of it going as compensation for victims and survivors, but a lot of it to teams of lawyers on both sides. So I have said in the past that for me, this crisis is personal, it's professional, it's institutional. Frankly, in some ways, it's exhausting. But tonight, I am very encouraged because we're not going to have one more ain't it awful conversation. We're going to focus on a particular part of this crisis that is central. And we're going to ask ourselves together, how did the law, how have lawyers, in some cases, helped us discover and address this crisis, in other cases, hide and minimize this abuse. And to do this, we have a wonderful group of people. Not all lawyers. We have a social worker, we have a journalist, but we have a prosecuting attorney and someone who is general counsel of, I think, the largest archdiocese in the country. Let me begin by asking you a general question, which is, and let me identify them. Tom Johnson he's in private practice in Minnesota. You need to offer him some sympathy. I think you're scheduled to get 15 inches of snow tomorrow. I went to Minnesota for a session in my alma mater on this topic, and I said, I'm not coming in January or February because it's too cold. And I went in January and it was 25 below zero. So a little empathy for Tom.
But it wasn't snowing.
Yeah. Tom was the county attorney in Hennepin County, prosecutor, and now has been appointed both by the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, and the Ramsey County Court to be an ombudsman, which is Minnesota speak for a representative, a liaison, an advocate for victims. Barbara has been an advocate for victims for decades, and we will talk more about how that began, but she has been a key leader in the Archdiocese of Boston in defending victims and speaking for them and creating programs, and now has worked until just recently with the survivors of the Boston Marathon. So she's seen a lot of loss and hurt and tragedy. Marge is the general counsel of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. She grew up in New York, was a corporate attorney and somehow got drafted into serving the church, and doing so at a time of enormous challenges as Los Angeles faced this crisis. And Peter Steinfels, as you know, was the religion reporter for the New York Times, covered this crisis going back decades, was editor at Commonweal, started an initiative like ours at Fordham, and has written a very provocative article on the Pennsylvania grand jury. So we have a remarkable range. There are others that we could have here, but let me ask, so as we look at this crisis in its twin dimensions, the abuse itself and the failed leadership that enabled it, how did lawyers help or hurt, impact this positively or negatively? And let me begin with Tom. You were a prosecutor years ago when this first surfaced.
I was. Well, let me give you a lawyerly answer. I think that the law at different times was relevant and irrelevant, and lawyers played a positive role and a negative role. And it depends on what time during the last almost, 70 years now that you're looking at what the situation was. Maybe more currently, it also depends on where you look, because I think there are places in the country where there has been a lot of good work done by using the law and good work by lawyers, and I think there are still other areas of the law, other dioceses that are still trying to figure out what to do. So what time you take a look at it and where you're looking. You start out with decades of secrecy, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And during that time, when the object, for the most part, I'm going to make some sweeping statements here, and they all should be nuanced, but for the most part, when the object was to keep it as secret as possible to the church, that this abuse was occurring by individual priests, laws that would require you to report that abuse to law enforcement and take other actions are pretty much ignored. Maybe there were circumstances in which the abuse was so horrific that they were reported, but the primary effort was to figure out how this incident didn't require reporting once those reporting statutes were enacted, and move on. I think Kathleen McChesney said this morning that was during a period when the sort of the operating the MO was you settle the case, if that's what it takes to get rid of it. You transfer you treat the perpetrator and you transfer him to a different area. That was what was happening. So the law wasn't very relevant. It wasn't playing much of a role one way or the other, but certainly not a very positive role. Lawyers, there's, I'm sure, lots of exceptions if you could, go back and look around the country in terms of what advice they were given. But I think it's fair to say that a lot were doing the bidding of their client and providing advice that was supporting keeping the abuse secret. I think the best example of this, and I think in hindsight, it was a horrific thing to do, and that was the confidentiality agreements that victims were required to sign in order to get some, in many cases, small payout. So their silence was bought, and in the course of doing that, they actually became a player in a conspiracy to keep it silent. So they came forward wanting the abuse to end, and left sometimes in shame later on when they looked at what they had done, by realizing that they had helped the church keep this secret. And that's an inversion of the moral order of the highest kind. worst kind. And that damage to the victims was very significant and lasting when you talk to them. So that was what was happening then. Then when you look at, when the secret came out of the veil and it was pierced, there was small little pinpricks through it with a lawsuit here and a lawsuit there. And then, of course, you have the Boston Globe expose and kaboom. If it's happening there, it must be happening elsewhere. And so there was a lot of attention then given to it. And you got the charter, et cetera, that on its face seemed to address it. But because I think the hierarchy in the church hadn't bought into what needed to be done, it wasn't fully addressed. And so come the last year or two, we're faced with another level of crisis, which is what you talked about, John, which was the failure of the leadership. And that also was very harmful. I'm looking at this mostly, folks, from a victim's perspective, okay? I'm the ombudsperson. And that was very, very damaging to find out that these individual criminal acts of clerics, their abuse became institutional, made institutional by the church through trying to keep those acts separate. Now, they did it in the name of trying to preserve the reputation of the church, but that was as it turned out to be in hindsight, and should have been apparent at the time because it was just a bad idea, the wrong thing to do. It should have been apparent that that's going to blow up and it's going to cost you in so many different ways, including monetarily, that you're not going to want to. It's going to be your worst nightmare, and that's what's happened. It's the worst nightmare. But through this, and I'm going to speak now just to the St. Paul Minneapolis Archdiocese. There were some good things that happened. Now, in our archdiocese, those good things were happening slowly because law enforcement was starting to pay attention to what was going on, and so, we got to look at this maybe a little differently. And then there was a priest that got caught abusing several children in his parish, and it implicated the archdiocese sufficiently in terms of what they knew or didn't know about the priest and whether they had reported it timely or hadn't reported it, etc., that the Ramsey County attorney, the elected prosecutor in Ramsey County, which is St. Paul, brings two actions, legal actions, against the archdiocese. One was a criminal action. This is not against any individual. This is against the archdiocese as an institution. And they brought a second action, a civil action, against the institution seeking to gain court jurisdiction to impose on the archdiocese means to protect the children that were in their care, so to speak, by the fact that they were interfacing with these children. And it was like, at that point, it was like a switch was flipped. I think it was fair to say that the archdiocese started to look at this entirely differently, and for the better. The law, boom, became relevant, and lawyers started doing good things. I'll give you two examples because I'm too far into my time. One was okay, what do we do? So we know we've been charged with these crimes and da-da-da-da. But what do we do with all the files that we have that were accumulated over the years where someone alleged that a priest had engaged in some inappropriate conduct? It may not have risen to a criminal act, but inappropriate conduct. What do we do with those? Well, they could have looked at the statute, and the statute wouldn't have required them to do a whole lot, because they could have said, well, the statute of limitation requires us only to go back this far, etc. But they made the decision, no, we're going to go look at all those files, and we're going to report to law enforcement every file in which we think there's credible evidence that there was inappropriate conduct, potentially criminal. And they defined credible evidence to mean that there was sufficient. Let me look here so I don't misstate this. Credible evidence was defined to mean, I wrote it someplace here. Sorry about this. That credible evidence is evidence that bears a semblance of truth and is not manifestly false or frivolous. Now that's a very low standard. It bears some semblance of the truth and is not manifestly false or frivolous. That was the standard that the Archdiocese decided to use to report to cases to law enforcement, even though the state statute said they only needed to report cases in which they knew the abuse was occurring or had reason to believe. Reason to believe is a very different standard than the credible evidence standard. And that resulted in many, many more cases going to law enforcement to look at than they would have otherwise have had to have reported. And yet the second example, and maybe we can get into this further, is a settlement agreement that the Archdiocese entered with the Ramsey County Attorney's Office that was 24 pages in length and really set up the framework for moving forward.
Let's come back to that, Tom, because
All right.
I'm going to ask you a more specific question. Margaret Graf, Tom described a continuum and a range of responses. You come into the Archdiocese of Los Angeles in the middle of all that. You have a very different perspective than Tom as a prosecutor. In what ways did the law and lawyers help? In what ways did it hurt?
Yeah. I was a corporate lawyer for many years in New York and then in Los Angeles. And I think there's a couple of things I want to say before I answer that question. Because one of the things you'll find my responses tonight are colored by, I think, what was my faith formation in New York, in upstate New York, country town, farm town, by parents who were committed Catholics. My mother was the first Catholic school teacher ever in the community. My father was vice principal, but never principal because he was Catholic. But within the home, we had a strong faith orientation. But we also had a very strong understanding that clerics, when sharing the sacrament, had special role representing Jesus and the legacy.
Is your microphone on?
Oh, maybe not.
Let me give you this.
No, I didn't turn it on.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, in addition to having no one in the front pew, the other way you can tell you're at a Catholic meeting is the audio visuals never work.
Right. I just didn't turn it on.
Okay.
Actually,
Peter, turn on your microphone.
In fact,
One holy Catholic and the auto visuals don't
right.
work. That's
Actually, I'm always incredibly impressed when you are at Mass, how priests manage the microphones. I'm always very impressed how they manage on the investment, manage the microphone. So I'm obviously not doing that well. But anyway, so I grew up in this heritage where, can you hear me now? Okay. Where when a priest was doing the sacraments, that really was meant that he was conveying Jesus and the faith of Jesus and the path of Jesus. But other than that, he was just another human being on his own faith journey with all of the impediments of being a human being. And I think, frankly, that orientation, when I then, in the late 90s, ended up on the Finance Council of the Archdiocese in Los Angeles as an outside lawyer and a corporate lawyer. And then in 2002, when I was asked to be on the special committee after Boston hit and a smaller working committee was put together, really informed and allowed me to do the kind of job I was asked to do in a moment of great pressure and great stress. And there I was a volunteer. And then the following year is a law firm that was about to be 1,000 lawyers. And so one day I made a comment in the meeting that come that summer, I might not be at a law firm. I was trying to figure what I was going to do. And 2 hours later, I got a call asking me to be general counsel. It is not a job I would have ever applied for. I would have never considered, and not even sure why I accepted. I did say, however, that the first people I had to talk to were our children and my husband, but particularly our children. And my husband had been a convert about 2 years before that. We'd been married for a long time, and he'd just become a convert. And the kids, because they at that point were very young adults, college age, just out of college, and they were wondering about this, and this was a stressful time, and that continues to be a stressor for many of us in our families and on these faith journeys. And one of the issues, as we talk about all these issues, really is we talk about all of this about the church. But I think one of the major factors we need to talk about as we talk about these issues, and I look around the room and see younger people, is whose church is it that we're talking about? And where are we reaching out to the people who aren't here in that dialogue? And to me, that is one of the most important things that we continue to talk about. The other thing is, in the room are some lawyers that I've worked with directly through all these years who are not from Los Angeles, one from Los Angeles, Ray Boucher, who was the leading plaintiff's lawyer when we had our large litigation. So he'll correct me if I'm wrong. Jim Gioli is here, Mark Chopko from USCCB, so they'll correct me if what I say is wrong. But I would say that
Not if they're smart.
what I would say about my experience, I think there's 3 or 4 things I want to say to frame the conversation, is it's very important to think about timelines. We need to stop in a moment and talk about timelines. Each time we talk about this was happening, that was happening. When we did the global settlement in Los Angeles in 2007, we settled 558 cases. The earliest case was 1931. Okay, so it's very important when we talk about these things because, and the same thing I think in your criticism, the critiques of the Pennsylvania report is it's constantly important, and it's important that we share and educate with media about timelines, so they'll just make that passing reference. So I will try to often reference timelines. But I came to the job, as I said, and this is the place of role of lawyers, I came to the job, as I said, as a corporate lawyer, not as a litigator. I'm married to one of them, so that's not one in the family. But I think that is the single most critical aspect of my job and my approach, is that I've been trained as a lawyer to resolve issues and solve problems, not win points. And I think that and the effort to build teams and be collaborative, and even Ray will say that one of the ways that we were able to settle and resolve the litigation in which he was the lead plaintiff's counsel was because we developed a collaborative approach that included the leadership of the hierarchy. It was not just the lawyers doing it, but it was, and it was a effort that recognized victims. And I think one of the big takeaways that we need to think about these issues as we talk, and as we talk today, and I think someone summarized today's day by saying, is that we need to gather data, we need to find best practices, but we need to look at it through the eyes of victim survivors, not just through the eyes of the institutional church. But if we do that, I think we will find journeys to solutions much more quickly. The positive and the negatives. I think that in California in 2002, I walked into a job in 2003, summer of 2003, the statute of limitations, that was the window for the statute of limitations in 2003 in California. First state to have a window. That I was told that they had been through all the files in the diocese. They felt there were 25 to 27 priests who had problems, and we might face 100 cases. And I said, okay, as a corporate lawyer, I think I can help manage that. As I said, we settled 550 some cases, 40% of which were religious order and other people. But this is the numbers were, the reality numbers are really much larger than people understood. And when you see, if you go to the websites, and there's a list of all the websites you can go to that we have documents on, if you go to the clergy files on the website in the Archdiocese, where we posted all the files, there were only 40 files in that litigation for diocesan priests. The notion of finding all this stuff and having all this information, it wasn't necessarily there. And I think anyone who's worked in this can be realistic about that. The second thing is, and I think that, the negative aspects of that, there was a sense of impatience. Hurry up and get it done. What can we do? It obviously took 5 years. The positive of that was the same impatience of let's try to get this done and get through this and move on with the church. So I think those kinds of tensions work both positively and negatively. In the years, it's sad that we are still talking about some of the same issues. In getting ready for today, I took the occasion to look at the book you did in 2003. I couldn't find it, so I actually had to buy another copy on Amazon. But
I'll get my 2 cents.
but you know, his I think one of the things that one of the really insightful things you said then, and we continue to talk about it and wrestle with it, is the reality of the institutional situation that allowed these things to talk about that you're talking about, is that within the church there's an expectation of transfer of clergy. So to the extent some of these things are clothed in, and we talk about the negative, a priest could be moved from one place to another, families didn't want to have it disclosed, all those kinds of things really were facilitated by the fact that people expected priests to change assignments. It wasn't a surprise when a priest went to one place and left your parish. So those kinds of things, and it was the parents just said, get him out of my parish. I mean, you read files and see that regularly. It sometimes wasn't even done maliciously. It also, often we need to understand the positive and negative of this, is where the psychological understanding of these issues were. And those of you who know, like in 1985 was the very first year that at St. Luke's Institute, which is a major treatment center in Maryland, was the very first year that a paper was written and presented about the issue, and the word pedophile was just being invented.
Okay.
So the only other is the other thing, though, I think that we have to really do, and the place for lawyers have been helpful, is I think we've begun to have a role in educating clergy and educating their consciousness, because I don't think they are as reluctant to learn. It's just that nor are they totally unwilling to change, but they are in a way remarkably naive.
Okay. Peter, turn on your microphone. On these lapel mics, I'm reminded of a story, you might have heard it, of a pastor who was using a lavalier mic for the first time, and he was convinced it wouldn't work. He went out and he said, "The Lord be with you. There's something wrong with this microphone." And of course the response was, "And also with you." Peter, you have heard a prosecutor talk about the sweep of this crisis. You've heard a diocesan attorney talk about the range of responses. You have covered this for decades. You wrote what seemed to be a pretty sober book, Church Adrift. Margaret, we look back on that as the good old days, you know. We were only adrift. You have been very clear in covering the failures of the church in this area, and you wrote, I think, an incredibly well-researched article about how the grand jury oversimplified, ignored some of the facts, and how the media ran with that in a way that both communicated some of what happened, and in other ways distorted what had happened. What do you think are the lessons? What do you think are the ways in which the law and lawyers have helped uncover this and made it worse?
Thank you very much, John. I want to begin by expressing incredible gratitude, not for being invited to this panel necessarily, but for the whole day's discussions, where I learned a lot and also encountered some very moving discussion.
This is the high dues we're paid for having had a good day today, right?
In any case, the guide, I've written out my remarks in order to make sure that they're brief. The guideposts for them are two things, John, that you have recently said. First, that we need to tell the truth openly, and second, silence is no longer an option. Telling the truth and refusing to be silent are essential in addressing church leaders. But my first point is that they are no less essential in addressing other authorities, and those include attorneys general, my fellow reporters and editors in the media, plaintiffs' lawyers, as well as church lawyers. My second point has to do with definition, and I'll get back to this because I think law and lawyers have had a lot to do with defining the sex abuse crisis for most people, also journalists. But right now, what precisely in the United States, not necessarily elsewhere, is the clergy sex abuse crisis? Is it the massive endangerment of children and young people in our institutions? A very comprehensive report on the crisis from the Leadership Roundtable quotes Kathleen McChesney. The number of reported abuse cases, she says, has dropped from about 600 annually between 1965 and 1985 to about 20 annually since 2004. And she quite rightly continues, more needs to be done. One case is one too many, and even if this scourge can never be completely eliminated, we need to come as close as possible to doing so. But I would ask you just to stop and think about those numbers. Last year, about 550 people were murdered in my native city of Chicago. If the city got that number down to 18 or 19, would we not welcome that as nearly miraculous? If the current horrid rate of deaths by gun violence or by opioid overdose were reduced, like Catholic clergy sex abuse cases, by almost 97%, wouldn't we raise a few hallelujahs? And this is my first point about the law and journalists, my profession. Anyone who fudges or minimizes such changes over time or time frames in general, as you mentioned, as I believe the Pennsylvania grand jury report did, is simply not telling the truth. And I don't think we can be silent about that. So if present endangerment, in my view, is not the key right now, right in this country, to the crisis, what is? My explanations would include the McCarrick case, the new globalization of the abuse scandal, in which this is now one story. We learned in 2002 that what happened in Boston was, not just a Boston story. It led to what happened all over the place, and this was then a national story. Likewise, what happens in Italy, Chile, France, Germany, Australia is now part of this story, and that presents various problems. Thirdly, the enlistment of the scandal in the Catholic Civil War over the papacy of Pope Francis. Next, the prospect of years of government investigations in the US likely to produce a drip, drip, drip of sensational headlines, draining morale and hemorrhaging the young. And the very real, and this of course I think is key to it all, the very real backlog of deep and devastating suffering, harm, anger, and the desire for acknowledgement and contrition and for justice and vindication, stemming primarily, but not entirely, from the sins and crimes of 30 to 60 years ago. And we will probably, I hope, be touching on some of those things in our further conversation. My third and final point is that law and lawyers not only helped hide and uncover the clergy sex abuse crisis, and I would mention that journalism did have a valuable role there, as well as survivors groups that were crucial to opening that up in the 1990s. But lawyers have also helped define, and I would argue, distort our understanding of the abuse scandal. We have a dominant storyline very much shaped by lawsuits, criminal cases, depositions, and the media sparring of lawyers. It has been framed, and I think this was true from first 100 days of 2002, by a conversion of plaintiffs' lawyers' best efforts to obtain recompense for survivors and the appetite of the media for a stark morality tale. Is that framework altogether wrong? Not at all. Is it like a funhouse mirror, incomplete and distorting? I believe it is. So I've tried to stick to my time limit and to avoid saying anything controversial.
Yeah.
1 out of 2 ain't bad. Every one of our colleagues have at some point in their eloquent and analysis said, we really got to focus on victims. Whether it's 600 or 20, whether it's 60 years or 6 weeks ago. You have spent your life standing with victims, helping them, advising, listening to them. You come back to Washington. I remember the first time I heard your name. It had to do with a visit of Pope Benedict to this country. There are 3 places in this country that have lost an archbishop as a result of this crisis: Boston, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Washington. Boston was first. Talk about your work with victims and survivors. Talk about what brought you to Washington, and talk about how the law and lawyers helped you comfort and stand with them and hurt those efforts.
I asked John before we began our little panel tonight if I could possibly not answer the particular questions about the law that the others on the panel have been addressing. And I wanted to do that because I felt coming here tonight, even when I received the invitation to come here to Georgetown and Washington, particularly in the month of April, had a significance for me personally and my own journey with the clergy sexual abuse crisis, as we have come to call it. So 11 years ago in April was the visit of Pope Benedict to Washington, to the United States. And as you know, this was 6 years after the crisis had just totally erupted in Boston and, of course, had spread throughout the country. And there was now this opportunity for survivors with Cardinal Sean O'Malley to have this meeting with Pope Benedict. And up to that point, there had not been a meeting with survivors with the Pope. There was tremendous pressure not to have this meeting. We had originally invited him to come to Boston. That was declined. We knew he was coming to Washington, and so pursued the possibility that there might be a meeting here in D.C. Again, people, those surrounding him, those advising him, other bishops, did not want this meeting to happen, simply because, and we know, most of us who are here old enough, who were within this time frame, that this was all anyone was talking about connected to the church. And it was extreme pain that the church was in. And for most of us, it seemed, of course, this is what he should be doing, coming to the United States, is not only meeting with survivors, but addressing this head on. So the meeting occurred, and I was very privileged to have the opportunity to be asked to assist with the meeting, to attend it with the survivors. And, you know, when we began the planning for it, I was asked to, to begin to think about how to plan the meeting itself. And I had a very, very long list of people, to be part of this meeting. And we keep getting these messages back on the number, and it kept going smaller and smaller and smaller. We ended up bringing 5 clergy abuse survivors to the meeting with him at the chapel at the Nunciature here in D.C. But because at that point we knew how, we had a sense of the enormity of just how the crisis had hit just in one archdiocese, we wanted to find some way to represent that at this meeting with the Holy Father. We had 5 survivors, but wanted to show him there were many, many more than the 5. So we collected as best that we could. I've had some good conversations with Terry McKiernan about this process, but we did everything we possibly could to identify the number of survivors known to us by then. By 2008, it included religious survivors of religious order priests, and we ended up with 1,476 names. And we asked an artist, really a calligrapher, if she might put those names into a book. And I have brought with me, whenever I have the occasion, opportunity to speak, I bring the copy of this book, and it seemed quite right to come back to Washington again with these precious names here again. And I think in that moment when the book was presented to him, I think Pope Benedict was just, how do you even describe it? He took a breath. He opened the book. He was overwhelmed with the emotion of just seeing all of these names. And now he had 5 people in front of him, but here was what we knew at that point. So for me, coming...
Can you show us what the
Yes,
book looks like?
Sure. And I'd be happy to, to just pass it around to you. When I met with this calligrapher, I had a very limited, I'm not an artistic person, and I had, kind of thinking white, black on white. And fortunately, the calligrapher that I really believe that the good Lord sent me to do this very special project had just this incredible imagination for how this should be. And as you know, there are many people who have certain names. There are many Davids, there are many Michaels, there are many Johns, many Marys, and she had this sense that she had to represent each name with a different calligraphy font and in a different way. So when I've had the opportunity to share this book with survivors and they see their name, David or Michael, whatever it might be, they look through the book and they look at it and they see a name that says David or Jane, and they say, that's me. That's my name. And the names with the small crosses after the names were the names that we knew of people who had died with suicide or drug overdose or some other tragic way. And then we had a middle page here that was sort of, you can see sort of the stars were to represent the names of all those that we did not know at that time. But I'm happy to have you see this.
Thank you for sharing that. We're going to turn to questions in a minute, but I want to start with you. If we were to look to the future, how would the law and lawyers help shape a system that was focused on victims and survivors rather than protecting institutions, rather than scoring points, to use somebody else's phrase? In this environment, given what happened 20, 30 years ago, what happens today, given what priests did, what bishops did not do, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and then I'll turn to our audience for questions. What would we need to do? What are some of the steps being taken or should be taken to focus this on the dignity and the rights and the healing of victims. I'll start with Barbara and then go to Tom.
I was interested when Tom mentioned how important it was at the point at which the confidentiality agreements were recognized for being very problematic for everyone, for the survivors, for the families, for the church. And the place where I think is really, in terms of law, is within our canon law system, because we are still have, in a sense, that level of secrecy upon it. We don't have time bars. These cases go on for decades. And this passage of time, like even here now, we're 11 years past this meeting with Pope Benedict. All of us thought going into that meeting that the sense of urgency that this was needed to be addressed with people that had a real fire on this. And now we are here, so many years later, and still in the midst of this crisis. Still, I know survivors who are cases decades long waiting to be resolved. And frankly, there's some thinking that the cases that have gone on appeal to the Vatican, there is no intention of resolving them. That the process will be simply, these men will die and the case will end. And I think that the church has a real opportunity within canon law itself to see this. I mean, there have been great efforts, I think, made and we've just heard about on the civil and even the criminal side to enable those aspects of our legal processes to be real agents of healing. And the canon law side of this is lagging far behind in terms of seeing itself as another opportunity to bring real healing and real confidence that the church understands the depth of the harm and the damage that's done. And I will say at this point in my own involvement with this, that the passage of time itself has its own damaging effects. Because in the beginning, we were dealing with, and the word that was even used in 02 and 03 was a sense of betrayal. I think the word that many are feeling now is a sense of abandonment. And we are on, the eve of the Passion, Holy Week next week, and betrayal and abandonment was the story of that week. And I think that survivors of clergy sexual abuse carry that passion in our midst. And I think it is now, if we can have that sense of urgency, not to let this moment pass, not to let Jesus be alone in the garden, not to let him walk the path without attending to that deep sense of betrayal and abandonment. And I think we have that within our capacity, especially within how canon law itself can be really transformed as to a path of healing, not a path of more weight and more a feeling like, does anyone even know my name?
I cut you off when you were talking about
That's fine.
the settlement agreement. I also hope you might talk about your role as an ombudsman. Well, if you were the person I heard at another meeting say, we have to build a process that revolves around the dignity of victims, what steps are being taken, should be taken to realize that goal?
Well, what I said and believe personally, but believe even more strongly because of the personal experiences that I've heard from victims who were victimized, victim survivors who were victimized 50 years ago. But the harm seems to get deeper for many of them. Not all, but for many, the harm seems to get deeper. And going forward, at all levels of the church and those who surround the church and provide any advice to those within the church who are making decisions. The approach has to be, and the lens at which you look at what decisions have to be made, needs to be from the perspective of the person who is the victim survivor, person who was a victim of clerical sexual abuse, and from the perspective of those who we don't want to be harmed in the future. That's the mindset that decisions have to be made by certainly the hierarchy, but it really has to transcend the hierarchy to include everyone who is making decisions that relate to the way in which victim survivors are perceived, treated, the respect they're given, etc. So that's very important. But I talked about earlier the moral order being inverted when during the period of time when the primary object was to keep the abuse secret, and the confidentiality agreements bringing in the victims into the secrecy plot. Lawyers don't have to give that advice. They often do because that's, they get clues from their client and they play off the client, but the client, they don't have to play off those clues. Lawyers that are coming out of the Georgetown Law School, should be thinking, well, what's the right thing to do here? My client maybe hasn't got it yet, but, I've got a responsibility to provide that advice. If they don't want to follow it, so be it. That's their right. I'm just here to provide advice, not orders. But there is a responsibility, and lawyers, tend to be pretty rational and persuasive in terms of how they present things. And if they say, look, if we do the right thing here, I still can give you some really good advice as to how you can get that done, and and accomplish some of the other things you want to accomplish, which is to minimize your risk and this reputational thing, we'll get it out there fast and take our hit, but it's going to be over. Lawyers can give that advice, and on the moral issue, and then on what's needed legally, in terms of just what the law what the law provides you to do or allows you to do to implement that strategy, and that's important going forward. But lawyers are also pretty creative people by and large, they should be thinking about are the laws that are now in place. I'm thinking mostly the civil and criminal laws, but certainly would apply to canon law as well. Are those laws really in the best interest of what we're trying to achieve here with this victim-centered approach? And if they're not, laws can be changed. Lawyers tend to think, well, if they're in the statute book, they're just a given. No, you can walk over to the Capitol and find a legislator to introduce a bill. And if it's in the public's interest, that bill can get passed. You can do that. And there are other things you can talk about as a lawyer as well in terms of the advice you give. We need to be thinking about how we're going to provide healing. The obligation of dioceses to reach out to the known victims if there hasn't been an outreach yet, and during the time when they were came with their complaint, when they left the diocese, they were a nobody. There was very little cases. Now, the Boston experience may be different, but from what I can see, there was very little time, occasion in which the person who came in to report a crime really ever got treated as though they had been victimized. That, you still can make up for that. If it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, if the person is still alive, the diocese can reach out to that person and say, hey, is there something we can still do to help you with the healing process? And it's a little outside of the legal system in terms of how it normally responds remedy-wise, but there's, an avenue called restorative justice, which I think is ready-made, for at least for some victims, to process the harm that was done and help the family members and the parishioners who were secondary victims get some sense of closure that they still don't have.
I should have mentioned this a while ago. If you want to join our conversation on social media, you can do so at GUCST Public Life or at Georgetown Law. What's your take? How do we build something? It sounds like you're doing some of that.
Let me just make two comments. And Ray, you might even chime in on this. The issue,
Oh, I don't know if we want to go there.
I know. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. But on the issue of confidentiality, in our global settlement and in the state of California now, the law is that confidential agreements can be entered in only at the request of the victim in these situations. We cannot ask for confidentiality, and we do not ask for confidentiality. Yet overwhelmingly, in fact, in all the cases we've settled, only 2 victims have said they do not want confidential treatment. It's a special little request on there. The issue with respect to the confidentiality of the perpetrator is irrelevant. We always disclose the perpetrator. So the real question here is balancing the privacy of the victim survivor, who in that particular circumstance may want privacy. And if they do, they're entitled to it. And if they don't, that's their privilege. But I think we need to separate on the confidentiality the difference between forcing the victim into a confidential situation versus allowing them to make that kind of choice. And then the second thing is, and again, the second other small point I'll make is on this issue of dealing with and recognizing victim survivors. And here's a small point, but I think it's an important one. And actually, and as a lawyer, I made up with a word that we used. In this fall in Los Angeles, we updated the lists of perpetrators, known perpetrators, as people around the country. LA, as you know, maybe you don't know, issued its original list in 2004. So it was very early to issue that, and it continued to update it. In 2008, we said we're not going to keep updating the list. Frankly, I just thought, do we have to keep updating the list? If we were making public announcements in all the parishes and church, and Bishop Accountability was keeping track of what we were doing, we don't have to actually update the physical list. And then again, this fall, when it happened in Pennsylvania, the sense was, okay, we maybe should go back and update the lists again, do an overall update. But in doing that, and in consultation with our oversight board, and frankly, very much at the emotional sense from Archbishop Gomez, when we came down to the issue of what do we do with victims to survivors who have come forward where the priest is long dead or has long left the Archdiocese, it's an old matter, and we really have no way to do anything better than maybe confirm time and place. In other words, we can confirm that I think I was abused when I was in 8th grade in 19 whatever, and in 1964, and yes, indeed, the priest that I think abused me was a priest at that parish at that time. We call that plausible. I called it plausible. Said, well, we have to come up with a different term because it's not exactly credible, but we came up with the allegation is plausible. And we included those names on the list to give the victim survivors the comfort that we knew and recognized their place. We didn't ask Rome, we didn't ask Washington, we didn't ask anybody. We just did it, okay? And I know it's gotten a little rattled around the country. Now what are you doing to us, Marge? But anyway, so be it is, but it was a way to recognize that victim survivor in a very simple way, because one of the things that's often a very powerful experience for a victim survivor is to recognize that you've appreciated and understood, that you recognize their story as having credibility.
Okay.
And those are 2 little examples, and I made up that word all by myself, kind of. Right?
John, can I ask you
real quick?
The way you're handling the confidentiality agreements is far, far superior to the way they were handled in the past. But is there some reason that the Archdiocese can't agree to confidentiality without requiring the victim survivor?
No. The Archdiocese does not ask for any confidentiality whatsoever.
I understand.
We don't in California now. The law's changed in California across the state now.
But when I'm coming at it from the perspective of the victim, and
Yeah.
do they need to be a party to the confidentiality? Do they have to say, look, if there is going to be a confidentiality?
No, they check the box. It's strictly a check the box by the victim, separate from the agreement. I'd like this to be confidential,
Right.
period.
And so they don't have to talk about it.
No,
But do they? They don't have to talk about it, regardless of whether they're
Right.
bound by a.
but
a
we've committed,
Just you that is it? Just the Archdiocese that's committing to keeping it confidential?
yeah,
Not the plaintiff.
that's right.
Okay.
But
All right. Fine.
Okay.
Good. I'm
Uh,
sorry, I didn't understand that.
Where's Anna? If we could put the microphone out there, and then Peter, in terms of sort of how do we value victims in this current environment, I gather you're not fond of the idea of grand juries and bishops sort of going to war in the media. What steps could be taken to show respect and dignity to victims?
Well, I think there are many steps, but this is my third event dealing with clergy sex abuse in 10 days. And all the events were mainly speakers, and the discussion was Catholic.
Mhm.
It seems to me that reflects a certain assumption that the outcome of this whole terrible story 10 years from now is going to be almost largely determined by what we within the Catholic Church do. And we all have our agendas of what we think ought to be done that would be better for survivors, would be better for the church, and so on. But I feel that I live in a somewhat different world from these discussions, where I live in a world where a lot of the outcomes going to be determined by what others do who are not within the church. And I feel that there's a disconnect in my own viewing of this. And so in regard to the future legal things, I think there has to be an effort by people of conscience, both Catholics and non-Catholics, who can be recognized as independent of any narrow defense of the institution, although I don't want to get into the corner of dismissing institutions as not important. I think they're terribly important. Who would speak to what was being done in the various investigations, done well, done rightly, done badly, done, really most unfortunately. I think that those of us who demand accountability and transparency have some basis for insisting on it in, other people's
Sure.
conduct, especially in the conduct of bodies that have some claim on our political and legal attention and authority.
Okay. Questions? Come to the microphone. My standard line, put your question in the form of a question.
Or your comment in the form of a comment.
If it's a short one, sure.
Yeah, I'll try to be as short as I can. I'm a victim
Lean
survivor.
right into the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Good.
I'm a victim survivor, and that's the exact term to use. It's not just survivors. Everybody tries to make that nice, and we are victims trying to be survivors. So victim survivors explains what happened to us as well as what we're trying to do. If I don't remember, instead of plausible, what I've come up with, I was brutally raped a few years ago. And so I know more about this than I would care to. And I had offered the man who hurt me, it's not a he said, she said. I went to the hospital. I have permanent pelvic damage. He was someone I was in a relationship with. I offered him restorative justice, which he didn't take. And instead, I had $1 million of lawyers after me because he's a very powerful, wealthy man. And they've been able to, as one of the senators said recently from Arizona, the system raped me all over again. When there's a lot of money after you, you have to be crazy or a bitch or something. It's terrible. But instead of plausible, one thing, the statistic on false reporting is 2 to 10%. So even people who might be looking for a monetary settlement, I've learned a lot about assessing credibility, detectives and everything. They know how to figure out a false report. It's really not that hard to figure out who's lying. Instead of plausible, I think it's better to credit people, because the opposite is to be presumed innocent if you're the perpetrator. The opposite of that is to say we're presumed truthful, which is not that we are truthful, but that we're presumed truthful. And that, rather than plausible, would go a long way for the people who don't have any plausibility. One of the things that I feel very strongly, and I wrote for Time Inc., I know, I've been in the New York Times, I know kind of how media works, and I see what victim survivors need, not just of the clergy abuse, but all of us being triggered by all of this. What we're looking to see the church do in some kind of institutional way, especially since we blew it since Boston in such a huge way, is if the victim survivors all across the country, whether they're ever going to come forward or not, and many of them are not, there are at least 8 people in each state, which would be 400 people. I bet there are 4,000 people. They're not going to come forward for the money, whatever. They don't want to dig it up again. It's just too awful, whatever. To reach those people who will never report, if they saw that the laity like us, and those of us who've been meeting in Georgetown, Holy Trinity, if they saw how the laity cared and said, yes, what I'd like to say is that the victim survivors were forsaken, and we, the laity, have been betrayed. If they saw that we're on their side and we're with them and we share and we would like to do whatever we can for them, that would be terrific. I wish everybody would write down the name of this project, Callisto, Callisto. It's an online reporting system and an information escrow database. And on YouTube, there's several, like 5-minute videos that explain from the woman who designed this, and she was raped in college and designed this because she found out later she was the third of 5 victims. And they know that the reason the victims report, the number one reason they report is so it won't happen to somebody else. So that's a powerful motive for someone. If this Callisto thing was in place, it would flesh out for all the people where the priest is dead. It would flesh out those people, because they won't, they don't want to come to the church. I wouldn't come to the church, okay? I've gone to the police. I've had to go to the internal affairs, 2 chiefs of police. It's unbelievable, the quote, I like to call them irregularities and peculiarities. But my black friends in Washington say DC corruption, man, okay? And there's no doubt about what can go wrong, and you would not believe what I have been through. And they are scared of that, and they don't see that we're all there for them. So it's either the church or it's law enforcement who can make mistakes. And it can be very intimidating to pick up the phone and report, unless I guess if there's a money motive, maybe, but I'll tell you, it's very stressful to call and report, even when I have injuries, pelvic specialist, 100 sessions of rehab therapy. There's no doubt what happened to me. So you can imagine when it's one person's word against another's. But this Callisto online reporting system, the person could put their name in, and you can flag it so that you just report what you want to for yourself and it's confidential to you. Or you can flag it that if someone else reports Reverend Jim Jones, then you flag your report to go forward with someone else's. And this would give hope to all of the people where the priest has died. They would know they can put into the system. And if someone else is reporting the same one, not only do they have the validation of being backed, but they also have someone else who's been through what they've been through. And I can't even tell you what that would mean to them. I think it shouldn't be lost, since we're in Washington, that Marty Barron, is the editor who broke the Boston story, okay? He's the Washington Post editor. So if we could get some kind of publicity on what the laity care about, that would be important. Now, something that's particular to me, but it's really an issue, there are other people, Bishop Malone, I could go on about stuff, which I'm not going to, but Bishop Malone, who was on the 60 Minutes special, outed, whatever, the idea that the church is lawyering up is so infuriating to victim survivors, not only of the clergy sexual abuse, but those of us who are victim survivors. When I went to my first meeting of the Restorative Justice Committee at Holy Trinity in September, I had been in the hospital because this drove me to being suicidally depressed, not just the rape, what happened to me afterward. And that's what people are so afraid of, because they've seen it happen to us. And especially if it's he said, she said, they know they're going to, if you have the wrong lawyer, they're trying to take you apart. And you just don't want to, you don't want to be re-raped. You don't want to walk into a rape situation again. Anyway, I came home because I'd been in the hospital because I was suicidally depressed. So I wasn't up on the McCarrick thing. So I go to Google him, and I can't tell you what it did to me. I found out a lawyer who had been hired to represent McCarrick in the civil case is the lawyer who has made my life a purgatory for 4 years. He is an unscrupulous man who is known to be. No, I need to finish this. This is very important, because I'll tell you, no victim survivors want to see our money, the money I give to Holy Trinity, the idea that part of that is going to Barry Coburn, who has made his name nationally by getting guilty perpetrators off. This is beyond the beyond. I spent a month in bed. I couldn't believe my church would hire such an unscrupulous man who's known to be unscrupulous, who's known to make his name, he's trying to be a big name and getting sex offenders off. And I called the Archdiocese and I said, please, first of all, don't hire him. Second of all, investigate him better. He's known to be an overcharging lawyer, and there are things on record for that. And third, look at his AVO rating. How did this happen? So with Bishop Malone, who's lawyering up in Buffalo and everywhere all around, these lawyers who the church may or may not hire to get involved in this, they've got to get the best people, preferably Catholics, not necessarily, but restorative justice people, and not any lawyers who have made their fortune in the $1 million that this man has made off my whatever. So I would like to see a nationwide thing of Catholics with their, best practices of how to hire, if they are hiring lawyers outside of the diocese, what the standards should be of how they are chosen, and that the parishioners. I'm sorry. This is important. No, I'm sorry. There's nobody speaking up. I go to things and it's like there's nobody else. Just if you stop interrupting me, I'm self-regulating. Okay. Anyway, if there was a thing where we say, please don't hire lawyers who are bad in that way, and also there should be some standard things that the civil settlements and everything can come to. They don't need to hire a lawyer for every single one. There can be standard protocols for each one everywhere. But the number one thing I would say is that if anybody can get any kind of press on this, particularly through the Washington Post, then other newspapers and magazines would pick it up. And I'm telling you, the victims and survivors. John, don't do this. Stop it.
Well, no,
I can get into a pissing contest with you, and I'm not some upset, weird woman, okay? I'm saying, I know this is so important. And I'm telling you, I grew up with many Catholics in Kansas who have left the church, who aren't coming back. There's so much money that isn't being given. There's so many people not in the church because they're seeing the church not handle this properly. And that's who I care about, is everybody I went to Catholic school with in Kansas who's left the church, and they're not coming back unless they see us doing better than we are. And your sense of urgency is absolutely right. The time to do this was last year. So anyway, the laity, this has to get out more. But please, did you write down Callisto, the Project Callisto?
And
if you
your
would
other
all look at it,
suggestions as well. Thank you.
and you'll
We're gonna
see that
invite others
it's an
to come
excellent
forward.
21st century law enforcement tool. And also the other thing with Callisto,
other people
no,
come
stop
forward.
it. I'm almost done, so stop it. Okay?
Please finish.
Look, I'm not speaking for myself. Really, it was a lot for me to come here today. I can't even tell you what I've gone through to come here today, all right? I'm doing it for other people. The other thing with Callisto is that it puts something in place for the church. The church would get a lot of press that they are the first ones to, as a big organization, to use this. But also it would be in place for any future whatever. So once it's in place, if everybody knew Callisto is there for anything having to do with any Catholic, it will be a deterrent and a preventive for future crimes starting now. Thank you very much.
Others who wish to
Can I just make
sure.
a comment? And thank you. I just want you to know that this Callisto that was presented by this woman who just spoke with us was discussed at the table today. At my table, someone did inform us about it, and so I'm grateful to hear about it again.
And we very much appreciate her explaining what happened to her and what should be done about it. Please share your question.
Okay, thank you, John. Dawn Eden Goldstein, professor of dogmatic theology, Holy Apostles College and Seminary, also victim survivor, author of books on healing from trauma. I just really wanted to thank Tom with a short comment, and perhaps others would want to say something as well related to something that Tom Johnson said with regard to that. Here you are, you're a lawyer, and yet you have a sense from your work with victim survivors that something more than a legal solution is necessary for healing. I do realize, Ms. Thorp, and I greatly appreciate it, that you also have been involved in healing. I'm sure others here have been doing certain things too. It seems to me, with regard to with what Mr. Steinfels said, that given that the number of new cases is dwindling, that it is important to put more energy into helping the large number of victims that we do have. And what I wanted to say is that I think that too often we get overly specialized in the church. So we say, okay, we've got the lawyers handling the legal side, and then we've got the psychologists helping victims, and so on. But it seems to me that anyone who has a lot of contact with victims should be at the table speaking about spiritual solutions too. So I was wondering, in addition to the restorative justice that Mr. Johnson mentioned, which is certainly something that's spiritual as well as psychological, if anyone else here had thoughts about what spiritual outreach by the church to victim survivors might look like.
In Los Angeles, okay, I mentioned that we work as a team, and team is very important. Team is me. Team includes the vicar for clergy. Team includes our victims assistance minister, who is a doctorate, and it includes spiritual directors. So we talk probably several times a day, okay, among that group. And so that team approach, I think, is critical, because we are trying to resolve a social issue,
Yes.
not just a legal dilemma.
Yes.
And I think it's a social faith, whatever you want to call it, but it's a pastoral issue. That's what it's about. It's not about the bifurcation and the segregation. It's about the commingling, because every aspect of this is all church.
Barbara, do you have anything to add on this?
Just that you really touch on something that obviously is so core to this, and that is spiritual accompaniment.
Exactly.
And that is, and that's a, long period of true relationship with that person through the thick and thin of whatever it is that they are facing, and that you do it in friendship, you do it in Christian love, and to support that person who has obviously faced a very difficult trauma. But that must be at the heart of what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Come forward. Join us.
My name is Tom Doyle, and I've been involved in this issue probably longer than anyone else in this room. From the beginning, that somebody mentioned a 1985 paper that didn't come from St. Luke Institute. That came from three of us who worked at the Vatican Embassy at the time, but Michael Peterson was a co-author.
And I misspoke. I just know that it was copied at St. Luke's.
You're right. It was copied.
Copied in the basement of St. Luke's. Was okay.
Okay. Let's run.
And on that particular issue, when it was offered to the bishops, they refused it, and they made a public statement to the effect that they knew everything that was in it. They didn't need any of the information. And a corollary to that, I was in a reception at the Vatican Embassy around that time, and an archbishop who is now deceased said to me, "Tom, don't get too excited about this issue, because nobody's going to sue the Catholic Church." I just have four little things I want to say. I'm not going to go on and on, I promise you. First, you want to know what good the lawyers did at the beginning? And I mean the real beginning, not 2002, but way, way back. The lawyers that the victims sought out did what the priests and the bishops should have done, but did not do. They believed them, they supported them, they gave them a shoulder to cry on, even though they weren't trained to do that, but they did. They did they made it clear that church isn't just a hierarchy, and that's a big mistake we're all making, is that we're limited to the guys that wear the outfits. Church is the people of God. It's not the hierarchy. Church is the people of God. Second, canon law is, for all practical purposes, in dealing effectively with this issue, useless, because it is a legal system in service to a monarchy. And canon law will become effective, really effective, when the system itself that it serves radically changes. Because you can put all kinds of things in place, but then the issue is making those things happen. But the major problem that we don't see, that canon law doesn't allow to happen, is the healing, the spiritual healing of these men and women, boys and girls. Several have said to me over the years, many have said that the worst pain they've suffered had been the spiritual pain. And many have said, I didn't realize I had a spirituality about me until it was taken away. Number three, I already said, the concept of church, we got to think about it as the people of God, because it's still, basically, even that jamboree that was in Rome, it's still all about the bishops, what they want, what they like, what they do, what they don't do. It's not about the bishops. It's about the victims, beginning and ending about the victims. And finally, one thing that seems to be left out all too often is the collateral damage to the mothers, the fathers, the husbands and wives, the brothers and the sisters. I've been involved in this issue all over the world, and I would say that some of the most gut-wrenching, painful experiences I've had have been sitting with mothers and fathers when they have told me what it was like when they found out their little boy or their little girl had been raped by a priest. And there's nothing quite as disturbing and as painful as that. Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership and your directness. Anyone want to comment on Tom's 4 points, and then we'll have one last question.
I would just like to, I feel like I should have met Tom Doyle years ago, and I'm glad to have a chance to hear you in person tonight, Tom. Tom is the John the Baptist of our, he was been the voice in the wilderness for years, a heraldic voice, and I thank you, Tom, that you're here with us still. It gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna.
John, I have a question. I'm not, I haven't been affected by this, but emotionally I'm affected by it because I can't sleep at night. And I haven't been able to sleep for about a year. And why? Because a member of the clergy told me something, and I carried it on my back. And I took it off of my back thanks to you. Not, you didn't do it, but it happened. And that was Cardinal Tobin came to Washington. And at one of these meetings, I went up to him and I put my hands in his hands and I said, I want this off my back. I can't sleep. What happened was a member of the clergy, who is very well respected and will remain unnamed and will go to my grave with me, told me what the Jesuits did here in the province, in Annapolis. It was just in the paper with our Attorney General of Maryland there, saying the statute of repose and you can't do this. You were right. You can change the statute. I'm a lobbyist. I'm not a lawyer. My husband's a lobbyist. We worked in Wisconsin. We work here. I am asking a question. Are there some young pups here that want to be lawyers, or older pups that want to be lawyers or lawyers that be willing to go with me? And I'm going to give my time to go back to Annapolis, help that delegate that just got it, he got it working over in the Senate, and work with our Jesuits who had hired a lobbyist, and that's what I was told about, to go down there and get that statute done the way it's done now. We want to undo it. Or I need your help, or I need to help you when you get it together. about what we can do to unearth that, to change it, or to just help bring these new lawsuits together. But we can't stand around and sit around and talk about this for the next 20 years. We have to do it now. I've been naive, and I thought I was a pretty sharp puppy with law and everything and how to get things done. I'm overwhelmed. The clergy they are naive. And you know what? They depend on this as their livelihood. They can't shake up the place. They can't. They're lucky to be able to operate from week to week. So it's up to us to do it. And I'm asking for some help. I will teach you how to lobby. It is a good practice to learn, especially if you want to be a lawyer. You'll make lots of money down the road doing something else with it.
Okay.
But come on, I need a couple of people to help us do it. So
And
I'm
you'll be
asking the
available in the
question,
back corner.
who will volunteer to help? And I want you to help me talk to the Jesuits and say, here's your opportunity to do some good about the evil that you did. Any hands?
Oh, we got
Thank
the
you.
man. Go ahead.
You're on. You're on.
I'm not raising my hand.
All right. That's
Oh.
all I need.
I'm waiting to ask the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right.
Help.
We are over time, so I see 3 people in back. Could you come forward, share your comment or question very briefly, and then we'll ask for a closing comment from our panel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Quick question. How do you resolve conflicts between minors and their parents when you're entering into these negotiations as a lawyer? I could imagine that at some point what the minor wants and what the parents want might be very different.
Come forward, Kim.
Okay. Hi, Kim Smolik with Leadership Roundtable. We've been really appreciated today. We've been listening to people talk about the release of names and how this is being handled legally in the country. One comment that I've heard from victim survivors is that every time names get released, it's another trauma or secondary trauma. And I'm also hearing from bishops and leadership in a diocese that there is a lack of feeling equipped to know how to go about this properly, and then not having the resources to hire great people like Minneapolis and St. Paul has done to go through this process the way that they have. And then we have the reality of the AGs releasing the names and handling the narrative, quite frankly, and not telling the narrative like what Peter said, that the facts that Kathleen McChesney was sharing. And so we have a chance to be transparent, be accountable, and to share these stories so that we can do them in a combined way, but we're not organized that way. And I'm asking you all if you talk today about, or if you have thoughts about how we can pool resources from our best universities, for example, that have law schools, to help address and help our church get organized so that we can put victim survivors at the center in our dealings with from the legal side.
Thank you. One last one.
I'll be very brief. I have here right to the point that the young lady was mentioning about the Maryland statute that laws just passed. And I'd like to present this, make a copy of it. It talks exactly, it was an editorial in the Post just the other day about how the lawyers, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm not going to knock lawyers, but they did their job. Maybe they did their job too good for the diocese.
Okay.
Maybe too good.
Yeah.
That's my point. I think.
Can I ask our panelists, we have several questions. One, children and their parents in a situation involving a minor. 2, release of the names. Is that a solution or a problem? How can it be done? How can dioceses be assisted? And then my question, we have heard an incredible level of passion and anguish from the 4 of you, from the people at the microphone. In light of that, why do you keep doing what you're doing? Why are you still a part of this family of faith, given what we've been through? So respond to the question on the names, on the minors, why do you do what you do, and why are you still a part of this family of faith? So let's start with Peter, and we'll go right down the road.
In all honesty, I can't say that the question of why I'm still a member of this family of faith has turned on this terrible question with which I was familiar as a summer worker at a Boy Scout camp, who found out that the assistant camp director was abusing 14-year-olds, and I managed to bring that to higher authorities, and he was moved to another state, taught in a high school, and through an incredible coincidence, later found out that he had continued abusing other people there. And this is what concerns me a little bit. First of all, a member of the family of faith who has benefited or suffered from education, I've had to face the fact that the church has a whole long history of terrible things that have been done in its name. Burning people for something that comes easily to mind. But I also know that if I did anything right at age 17, it was partly the result of what the institution had done for me, teaching me about truth and speaking out and so on. And I would like my grandchildren to have the benefits in terms of larger meaning, sacramental life, moral compass that I think they need and that I think they'll need to get from the institution. So in closing, I guess, I absolutely know what you mean, John, when you say focus on victims, survivors, rather than the institution. But I would not contradict that, but qualify that in a way that I think we do need to be worried about where the institution is in 15, 20, 30 years from now.
Just to comment, I think by focusing on victims, we ensure that the institution will not only be there, but be healthy and true to its values. So, Marge?
Why do I keep doing this? I don't play golf well. No, that's not the reason. I think I keep doing it because of those moments when I do deal with victim survivors, and they give me a hug and say, "Thank you for what you did for me. Thank you for this resolution. Thank you for this help. Thank you for this thing." Or when someone calls and they said, "I've finally been able to tell my son," though a victim survivor says, "I've now been able to tell the whole family." Those things where we do make a change, and whether we're doing it because we're the lawyer or we're part of that team, we're part of that church, we're that sort of that face of doing it. When I hear the publication of lists, a very complicated question, but when the question comes, if we're going to do it, we're going to recognize it from the victim's point of view, not from our institutional point of view of what do we have to disclose. So when you begin to say those kinds of things, I see are healthy things that are changing. And I'm not going to be rude, except that I'm worried about making a plane. So I'm going to excuse myself, okay?
You're excused.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening and sharing, and the physical reactions of yes and no has been extremely empowering. So thank you all of you for being here, and
Thank
for
you, Margaret.
all letting me be on
Yeah.
the panel.
Marge wins the door prize for coming the greatest distance and will take a flight back to California tonight. So we're very grateful. Marge, you, you have been on the front lines of this for decades. Why? Why are you still here?
I think the stories, the voices of the survivors and their families, they have a claim on all of us. I felt profoundly privileged to, even from especially in the earliest days when people were coming in, at the Archdiocese of Boston who had no reason to trust anyone, and that trust had been so shattered. And to tell your story is an act of incredible vulnerability and trust. And I feel a deep obligation in a sense, but not a burden, but that I must hold those stories as a treasure. It's holy ground. I share that ground with all of you too, and all of us in this body of Christ. And I think we walk this together. And I always in a group like this, I see the faces, and I know we have to carry on for the sake of the Lord, and it's
Thank you.
important.
Will you leave your book here for
Yes.
a while?
Yes, sure, of course.
People want
Yeah.
to take a look at that.
Of course.
Tom, you have a different relationship with this family of faith. It's not like you inherited this, you've chosen this. Can you share why?
Sure. Well, I became a Catholic 2.5 years ago. Married to one for cradle Catholic for 33 years before it came to the church, and that I held out as long as a stubborn Swede could hold out. But there were two reasons. One is I had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and a switch was flipped, and I felt so incredibly grateful for my life. And I needed some place to put that gratefulness. And I thought, it's got to be God. And so I thought, if I'm going to be grateful to God, I probably should go to his house every once in a while as a member of that house. So that was reason one. Reason two is sitting on the second row there, and that's Father Dan Griffith. And my wife had become the church administrator for his parish. And at the time, he was the delegate for safe environment, and I just walked into that job. That's the person who within the Archdiocese is responsible for figuring out how to investigate and what sanctions should be recommended, et cetera, if you've got a priest that's engaging in inappropriate conduct. And he's a smart guy. It took him a very short time to figure out, why is a priest doing this? A priest with no investigative experience or training, and a priest who's got relationships with people who he should be investigating. This should be done by professionals. And that was a recommendation he made. It was acted upon, and we've got Tim O'Malley. Where was Tim? Tim, there he is. Tim, there he is, standing in the back, who came then into the job, is now the Director of Ministerial Standards and the Director of Safe Environment. But Tim brought a long history of being working with the FBI. He was superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for Minnesota, a lawyer, an investigator of the highest order in terms of experience and integrity. He's now heading up the department within the Archdiocese, and his staff does an exceptional job. So that was to see that recommendation, knowing that we had people there. He also had to deal with an archbishop that needed to be investigated, and he did that. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second, this isn't all about bad people. There are really good people here doing courageous things, and I should support them. So those were the two reasons, primary reasons that I came into the church, and 2.5 years later, I don't have any doubts about the correctness of the decision.
Well, it's been a powerful evening, in some ways a raw discussion. We're very grateful to the participants. We're especially grateful to people who have come out on an evening at 6 o'clock. We're very grateful to our colleagues who have put this together. Anna Misla, Kim Daniels, and especially our colleagues, our hosts at Georgetown, Dean Treanor, Amy and Mary and others who have made us feel so welcome. And part of that welcome is we have a dessert reception. So please join me in thanking our panel. Join me at the dessert reception. And you may want to take a look at this stunning book. Thank you very much.